you're technically a millennial. That's the bracket. That's what the chart says. And every single time someone describes millennials online, the avocado toast, the participation trophy, the growing up on social media, the iPhone and adolescence generation, you feel absolutely nothing. Not offended, not defensive, just, that's not about me. You recorded songs off the radio onto a cassette tape and held your breath when a car drove past, in case the noise ruined it. You memorized your best friend's home phone number because there was no other way to reach them. You watched the internet arrive in your house like a guest who slowly moved in and never left. You were 12, maybe 13, and suddenly, there was this machine that opened something beyond your neighborhood, beyond your school, beyond everything you had previously understood as the edges of the world. But before that screen arrived, you had a full childhood, with outside and boredom and nothing to do but figure it out. You already knew who you were before anyone could watch you becoming that person. And when you say you're not really a millennial, there's nowhere to go. Because you're not Gen X either. You don't have that latchkey cynicism, that Reagan-era distrust, that Nirvana on a cassette identity. You live in a space the generational labels never quite reach. Here's what the psychology actually says about why you are exactly the way you are. Let's start with the two generations on either side. Because to understand elder millennials, you first have to understand what they're not. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, came of age during genuine economic anxiety and cultural cynicism. These were the latchkey kids who raised themselves after school in an era of stagflation, Cold War paranoia, and institutions visibly failing the people who trusted them. Gen X built its psychology around self-sufficiency and ironic detachment, not as personality choices, but as survival tools constructed in childhood, out of necessity. Then there are the younger millennials, born 1990 through 1996. They grew up with the internet already present. Social media arrived when they were 11 or 12. Instagram shaped how they understood themselves before they were old enough to drive. Their sense of identity formed in public, photographed, curated, and measured in real time. The smartphone wasn't a tool they learned to use as adults. It was the environment they developed inside. Elder millennials, born 1981 to 1986, fit neither description. Too young for Gen X's defining hardships. Too old to have been shaped by a digital adolescence. They sit at the exact hinge point between two fundamentally different childhoods. And what that specific position did to their psychology is something researchers have only recently begun to examine on its own terms. The term psychologists use is cohort effect. A cohort effect is the way people born within the same narrow window of time develop psychological traits that are distinct from adjacent groups, not because they're fundamentally different kinds of people, but because the historical and cultural conditions they pass through during their most formative years were genuinely, measurably different. Even a gap of 3 or 4 years, at the right moment, can produce a psychology that has almost nothing in common with the group sitting just beside it on the timeline. For elder millennials, the cohort effect runs through one specific axis. They are the last generation to have had a fully analog childhood, and the first to adopt digital life as teenagers rather than as children. Stay with me, because this distinction matters more than it sounds. Picture this. It's 1995. You're 13 years old. Your family just got its first home computer. AOL installs itself over the phone line with a dial-up shriek that will live in your memory for the rest of your life. And you're sitting in front of a screen that connects you, for the first time, to something beyond your street, your school, your town. You spend the next several years building a second life in that space. AIM away messages become your first form of public self-expression. You download music on Napster at 3 in the morning. You burn CDs for people you like instead of playlisting them. You have a social life that moves, slowly and then all at once, from the physical world into a digital one. But here is what makes this cohort different from every generation that followed. Before any of that happened, you had already built a self. You had years of childhood, of boredom and outside and no audience, in which your identity formed without anyone watching. When the digital world arrived, you didn't grow up inside it. You walked into it. That is the distinction younger millennials and Gen Z never had access to, and it shaped everything that came after. The economic dimension of this cohort's psychology is equally significant. Elder Millennials graduated from university between approximately 2003 and 2008, entering the workforce in the direct aftermath of the dot-com collapse. And for those who graduated last, straight into the 2008 global financial crisis, at the exact moment they were supposed to be laying the foundation of their adult lives. Student debt, entry-level salaries, no savings, maximum exposure, minimum cushion. Research published in the Journal of Political Economy by economists Hannes Schwant and Till von Wachter found that workers who entered the labor market during a recession experienced earnings deficits that persisted for more than a decade after the economy recovered. Not a temporary setback that self-corrected, a lasting recalibration in income, in accumulated wealth, in career trajectory, that the data tracked across 10 years of follow-up. This generation didn't just have a difficult beginning, the timing of that beginning followed them. And here is where the framing shifts entirely. Because what looks like being caught between two worlds is, in psychological terms, something with a specific name and a specific value. It's called dual fluency, and it is rarer than it sounds. Elder millennials know what it means to be unreachable, and they know exactly what it costs to be constantly reachable. They built their first sense of self without an audience, which means their identity is less dependent on external validation than generations whose self-concept formed in public, in real time, with a like count attached to it. They didn't grow up inside the attention economy. They watched it being built from the outside, and then chose how much of themselves to bring into it. Researchers who study resilience consistently identify the experience of navigating between distinct cultural environments as one of the strongest predictors of adult adaptability. People who have had to learn two different systems, who have lived in one world and built competency in another, develop a cognitive flexibility that people raised entirely within one system rarely need to build. Elder millennials did not get a clean generational identity. What they got was fluency in two fundamentally different ways of existing in the world. And the psychological literature is fairly clear on what that kind of fluency produces. People who are harder to destabilize, more capable of holding ambiguity, and more likely to function well when the environment changes without warning. They are not the generation that got lost between the labels. They are the generation that learned to live without needing one. There is something quietly significant about the people who never quite fit the categories available to them. Every generation gets a story, a defining crisis, a set of traits, a label that travels ahead of them. Elder millennials never got a clean one, and for a long time, that felt like a gap, like something that should have been there and wasn't. But the people who live on the seam between two worlds develop something the people at the center rarely need, the ability to understand both sides. Not from a distance, from inside. They grew up in one world and learned to move through another. They didn't need the label to know who they were. They already knew, before any of it had a name. If this finally put language to something you've carried for a long time, hit subscribe. There are a lot more videos here about the generations the mainstream conversation keeps getting wrong. And if this one landed, you'll want this next. The psychology of baby boomers. The generation that raised you, why they are the way they are, and what the world that shaped them actually looked like from the inside. That video is right here.